Hello everyone. So this is going to be a very interesting video because we'll learn about what's new operator, what's instance of operator, and what are constructor functions. And we are going to see some very cool things that you need to understand. So let's start looking at what's there when we create a function. Let's say that I create a function f1. So I've created a random function that does something. So it does something. Now I need to check how does the object of this function looks like. Let's open it up. Okay, so it has some specific properties to it, which are arguments. Since there are no arguments, predefined arguments, it says they're null and caller, all those sort of things. There's a specific thing. There is one thing that is there, that is prototype, that is function itself. It's the prototype of this object, that is function prototype. But with prototype there is one more thing. There is a exact value, sorry, exact key named prototype. Now what is this? Let's open it up and see. This says that this is an object with a key value pair of constructor, and within the value of constructor we have the same function. Okay, so and and it will go in circles if we keep opening it, because what we have stored within this prototype value is we have stored a value constructor, and that value constructor points to the function itself. So it's kind of goes into circles if I open it again and again. Understanding this would be important to understand how new operator works. So we are first trying to understand how does a function look like. Uh, if you don't know, in JavaScript everything is an object. In JavaScript everything is an object, and when we create a function, say we created this function f1 that is just returning true, pretty simple one. What actually JavaScript did? JavaScript created an object named f1 with some specific properties that are listed here. And one of the most interesting property that this function has is this prototype value. Prototype. And we need to look carefully that this prototype value points to the same object, f1. Oh, my bad. This prototype value doesn't point to same object, but this prototype value is an object which will have two things. First, by default, it will have this constructor, and this constructor will point to f1, and another prototype value. So that prototype will be the prototype of this object. That is by default capital object. So we can ignore this for now. That is not important, but we'll focus on these parts. And the point to be noted is that this prototype is not the prototype of this object, but it's a key value pair that is stored. And prototype of this object is function prototype. As for arrays, we have an array prototype. For functions, we have a function prototype that stores all the values that a function can access. So function can be called with apply, bind, call, and all sort of things. So those things are here, but this prototype value is different. And if it's there, then it should be used somewhere. A pretty valid question, right? If this prototype value is there, then it should be used somewhere. There it is used. It is used when we call this function with new operator. Now let's see when we call a function with new operator, what new operator does. Right. So let's try to do this. Let's say new f1. So what new operator? How we use new operator? We write new and then we pass an object. Then we pass an function object to it. So we usually call an function after new. We write new and after we call a function. Now let's just hit enter and see what this new operator returned. This new operator returned us empty object with a particular prototype value. Let's see what prototype we have. Okay, so it's the same prototype that was defined inside this function. It's the same prototype that was defined inside this function. So first thing that we can understand from this is that new operator returned us a new object, right? This object was not there previously. This new operator returned us. New operator creates a new object, creates a new object. Then it sets the prototype of this object to the prototype value that is defined within the function that is alongside the new operator. Now this point is very important to understand and to grasp and to remember, because generally when people talk about new operator, they particularly miss this point. So if you read most of the articles that are out there on internet, they'll miss this point that new operator does. That new operator sets the prototype of the newly created object to this prototype. So it's something that's not very popularly discussed, but new operator does this as well. And now that it has set, now first step is it creates an object. Second step, it sets prototype value. Prototype value for this object. And what does it sets the prototype value to? To the function alongside. So for this particular use case, it will set it to. So function will be an object, and inside that object, we have a key called prototype. Function dot prototype. Second thing what new operator did is it set it up the newly created object with the prototype value of the caller function's prototype value. So f1 dot prototype, and we need to be very clear about it that this is not equal to not equal to f1 dot underscore underscore proto. These two are very different things. See, if we are talking about f1 dot underscore underscore proto, then that is this. It will be a function type. Function type. Right? Because f1 is a function. But f1 dot prototype is a different value altogether. f1 dot prototype. Okay, I pointed to the wrong object here. Let me erase it. Yeah, here. Function type. See, here I want to point. Yeah, and f1 dot prototype is not a altogether a different value here. It's a now what it holds. It holds a value called constructor. What it holds? A value called constructor, and constructor actually points to the same object. Constructor points to the same object. So it will go in circles if I open it up. We have tried to open it previously, right? So now what third thing new operator will do is new operator will call the function f1 now. It will call the function f1 with context of this newly created object. Say this object, let's give it a temporary name. Say this object is x. It will call the function f1 with newly created object. Okay. Now, first two steps we can see, because new operator returned us an object. So you can believe me when I say that that it created an object. You can believe me there, right? Second thing, we can see the prototype is set. The prototype value for the newly created object is set to the prototype value that was there. See, this is equal to this. So this also you can believe when I say that new operator is doing it. But when I say it will do this, it will call function f1 with context of the newly created object. Then why would you believe me, right? So let's print it out very quickly and see if it does that. Just remove these parts. And let's test it out quickly. So what we'll do is we'll modify here and we'll console.log this. And now we'll again call new operator with f1, and this particular object came from console log. Let's open it up. Okay, it is an empty object, same as here, and okay, it holds the same value. It holds the same value that is returned. So now we are sure that this was bounded to the newly created object, because this newly created object is returned as well, right? So what here is what new operator does, but there is one more question. We didn't return anything from this function. Is it the new operator that returning the new object, right? What new operator did is it created a new object. Okay, we believe it. Then it set it up. prototype of that newly created object to the function.prototype value. Okay, we understand that and we believe it as well. What's next is it calls the function f1. It calls the function f1 with context of the newly created object. Okay, that also is okay. But then how we are getting this return value? Why it is not undefined? Because our function was set to return true. Our function was returning true, right? Why? Why do you think? Why do you think that it, instead of returning true, it is returning as an object? Confusing, right? So if I call function f1 directly, see what it will do. It printed window because this points to window from our console log here, and it returned true. But how on earth it is returning an object? So this is also a property of new operator, and let's talk about this. That if I do not return anything from my function, there are three cases. Pardon. If I do not return anything from my function, then new operator is very clever. It checks that okay, f1 is not returning anything, and this new operator is specially designed to create new objects, right? So what it does is says, okay, f1 is not returning anything, let me explicitly return value of this, and within this function, and what this was bound to x. So what new operator did is it implicitly returned the newly created object. This is the first case. Now let's see what's the second case. Second case is what we just did previously, that we had this definition where we were returning a primitive value, and what happened, that it again instead of returning that primitive value, it again returned returned an object. So why was this the case? Because again, new operator saw, wait, this function had to return an object, because the sole purpose of new operator is to create new objects. That is why it is the first step is to create new objects when we write new operator, right? So new operator saw, okay, this is a primitive value, but this was not the expected behavior. So let me remove this primitive value and again return the object that I have created. So in the second case as well, when there was nothing returned, it said I'll pass the newly created object that I created previously. When there was a primitive value, it said, okay, primitive values are not needed, so I'll again return the newly created object that I've created. But third case is a little different. In third case, what we do is, say, instead of a primitive value, we were returning an object. Say we were returning b colon 8, this. And now if we call new, so instead of returning the newly created object, see, this was the newly created object and its prototype was pointing to the function's prototype value. But this is the object that is returned, and it has the usual capital object prototype. So it's not the same. This object is different, and this object is different. So let's see what it did now. Now, since we had returned a non-primitive value, i.e., since we had returned an object value, object, since we had returned an object, so it returned that object as is, because the whole purpose of this statement was to create a new object, and new operator saw that okay, function f1 is returning an object. So let's do one thing. If it is returning an object, then let's just let it return what it is, what it is returning. So we saw how new operator works. Now let's quickly summarize what new operator is doing and how new operator works. And then we'll talk about what is instance of operator, and then we'll see that how we'll leverage all this to use functions as constructor function. Let's quickly revise it once. First of all, we saw that every function that we created a random function f1, and we saw that every function we create has a value prototype, has a key value pair prototype in it, and that prototype is not the actual prototype, and actual prototype value is the function prototype value as it should be, but this prototype is a key value pair that is something different. And what it holds a key called constructor that points to the same function again. So every function that you'll create, you can create any function right now on your machine and check. This will be the behavior. So every function has a particular key called prototype. That's the first point. Then when we call new operator, it does a certain steps. First step is it creates a new object, say X. Second step is it sets the prototype of this newly created object as the prototype value of the function with which the new operator is assigned to. So in this case, new operator was assigned to this function called f1. So it assigned the prototype of that newly created object to f1 prototype. Okay. Now, third thing what this new operator does is it calls this function f1. So the call, we have made the call. So it's pretty obvious that the call will be there, but this call goes through a particular bounded context of this newly created object. And what we mean by that is when this call will be executed, this will point to this inside the function will point to this newly created object. And we saw it by trying to console log the value of this object. So it was not coming out as window, but it was coming out as a newly created object that new has passed to it. And then once that call is done, there are three cases. Number one and number two will be either will return nothing or will return a primitive value. So in case we return nothing or a primitive value, new operator will replace those things to the newly created object. So it's actually when we return nothing, we return undefined, and undefined is basically a primitive value, right? So those two cases are same, but still. And if in case we return a custom object from inside of this function, then new operator will let it flow. So we understood how new operator works very briefly. Now let's also see like what is instance of operator and how and why we are talking about it. So instance of operator, and we'll also talk we'll use instance of operator towards the end of this lecture. So let's just see how it works. I mean, we'll get to see the significance of this operator towards the end. But for now, what we can do is we can see how instance of operator work. So instance of, we can say F1. We can try to log this, and we can remove the statement from here for now. Now if we call this, it says true. So what instance of operator actually does is that with whatever is the object that is passed here, it checks within the prototype chain, within the prototype chain of that object, that if f1.prototype is present anywhere, if f1.prototype is present anywhere, what instance of operator will do is that it will check inside this object. So by this we means what is passed here, it will check within this object that whether this f1.prototype is somewhere down the prototype chain. What's prototype chain? We have discussed in the previous video, right? So if it finds this, and it will obviously it will find it there because it's the first prototype, right? Because new operator has set it the prototype to f1.prototype, and this is what instance of operator checks. So we can also check it in an alternative way using this new f1. So instead of anything else, what we need to do is we need to check f1. So this is from the function call, and this is what it returned. It returned us true because just the object that it has returned had the prototype value of f1.prototype. So this is what instance of operator does. And how we can use it? We can use it to check whether this prototype value, whether a particular prototype value is there down the prototype chain somewhere or not. Okay, so that was a lot of talking over new operator and how it works. Let's just clear the screen for now. And now let's focus on what are constructor functions. In last lecture, okay, I was kicked from this board. In last lecture, what we saw is there we need to create. So we hypothetically saw that we'll have two things. One is prototype and one is a constructor function, and would have to set up both to have this class like feature within JavaScript, right? So now why did we need a constructor function in first place? To create similar looking objects again and again, right? And now if we back here, if we look at what we are doing here with new operator, what we do is we create a new object every time the new operator uh, uh, is written there with a function call, and that newly created object is then passed to this function. So and function is an organized way of making a piece of code run again and again, right? So what we can do is we can create a very clever function. Say we create a very clever function, fish will imitate what we needed in here. We needed a function that will create a new object that has two values, age and weight. So this function will take two values, weight and age. And what it will do, it will set dot this dot weight equal to weight, and it will also say this dot age equal to age, and let's hit enter. Now if we call new operator with fish and we pass some weight to it and an age to it, let's get variable as well. Nemo is our fish. And now if we check our newly created object, then we have an object. We have an object with 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 a particular structure, and now we can create any number of objects again and again without bothering much about what properties should be there for this object or what we need to add. So we created Dory. So we just saw, now we just saw how we can create constructor functions. This right here, what we created is a constructor function. Technically, any function that is not arrow functions work very differently. They cannot be bound with a custom context because they have a very tightly bound context with the place that they are created in, and that's a different discussion, so we'll not go there. But in simple words, we cannot use new keyword with arrow functions. It will give error and it would not even run. So other than arrow functions, we can use any function as a constructor functions, technically speaking. But usually what we do inside a constructor function is we point this dot weight and this dot age. So we use this particular way of assigning values to some predefined to some properties in a certain way, right? We use this kind of syntax to assign certain values that we pass to our constructor to the properties inside the newly created object. So this right here is a constructor function. Hope we all understood it very well, that how we leverage new keyword, and with new keyword how we leverage functions to create to create new objects like this, right? So this is the concept of constructor function. Now let's see one more interesting thing here. What we need to do now, since we have this new object, what we wanted is that our new object should point to a particular prototype object where we'll set up this function swim. And if you see our newly created object already points to a particular prototype. And what it points to? It points to the prototype value within this function, right? So if we print fish and see, here, it points to prototype value of this function, right? This that we discussed, that's the first thing we discussed. And why it points to this value? Because new operator has set these values in such a way that it points to this value. Now, because we have these prototype values set to the function dot prototype in place, we can also leverage the same to do the second part that we wanted to do here. We first thing we wanted to do is to create a constructor function, and second thing was to set up a base object or prototype object that will be used as the prototype of the newly created object. So how we can leverage it is, say we needed to add this swim function here. So what we will do, we will say fish dot prototype dot swim. We need to add a new function swim on the prototype of fish, and we'll say function, and for now let's just return I am now swimming from this function. I missed something. ETURN. Okay, I missed something else as well. Let's put us in. What I'm missing? FUNCTION, unexpected string literal. Okay, on line number 2 it says unexpected string literal. Oh god, I'm missing that spelling. Probably I'm sleepy now. Late. Okay, now this is created. Now, so since it was these were created previously. Oh, now if we check Nemo, right? If we check Nemo, since it points to the same prototype object that we have now modified, so all this new function that we have created is there within prototype of Nemo as well, because we modified the same prototype. So now Nemo can actually swim. Oh, ah, isn't it interesting how we can leverage simple functions to create new objects and set prototypes and set custom prototypes as well by simply writing small pieces here and there. I mean, we didn't really did anything new that most of us don't know. We just wrote one function here. We just wrote one function here was the first thing, and we just added this swim function to our functions dot prototype value. These are the two things we did, and we achieved both of these things that we were discussing yesterday. Now we know how we can write constructor functions. Constructor functions are just normal functions that, with use of this operator, set some values within the object that is bounded to context. And when we call this particular function with new operator, it acts like a constructor function. And we can also set up this prototype using this by leveraging how new keyword works. And what we need to do is within the prototype keyword of constructor functions object, we need to embed our custom properties that we need to add. So that was the whole discussion for this video. Now I will quickly summarize on how we can create constructor function, and then we'll close this discussion. So let's do one thing. Let's clear this up and refresh the window. Let's quickly see how can we create a constructor function. So constructor functions are just normal functions, function, which have some name. So say this function is fish. It will take some properties, weight and age. Apart from fish, what it will have, it needs, so it will be called with a particular context, and within that context we need to add these new values. Say we will add weight, comma, age, sorry, let's add weight, age, and within the prototype value, so prototype is a different value within this function, within this function that we have created. Let's first see it as well. Prototype is a separate value that will be set as the prototype of the newly created objects that we'll create using this constructor function. So within fish.prototype view, we'll add a new function there, that is swim. That is function And now we can use it to create new objects. Say we create an object Nemo, that is a fish, and we use new keyword here. And we'll pass some weight and this value. Again, we can also create other objects, say Dory, and let's see how these new objects look like. These new objects look like this, and these new objects can also access the functions that are added to the prototype. So these are constructor functions. This is how we use them. Now in next video, we'll see how this constructor function is little dangerous to use and how it can pollute the window object, and what do we mean by polluting the window object, and how we can save us from doing something like that. And we'll have a little more discussions on some things that surround. Okay, let's jump to the next video.